Hey, everybody, it's Tammy de Leeuw with a special edition of the Biscuits and Gravy podcast. I bet Elizabeth didn't even know that it was called the Biscuits and Gravy podcast, but she's close enough to the South where she understands that reference, I think. Biscuits and gravy, you eat it once in the morning, it fills you up all day. So our content is designed to give you that fulfilled feeling. And what we're doing here today is talking about what everyone's talking about, the coronavirus. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I was talking to my friends and family, and they poo-pooed everything I said. They said, oh, you know, put the tinfoil hat on. You're crazy. This is just like SARS. This is just like H1N1, all the other things we've had. It'll go away. It hasn't, because the math is showing us that it multiplies exponentially. So my guest today, for those of you who have businesses, particularly real estate businesses, you need to know that wherever there's a disaster, there's a pool of lawyers somewhere, get just ready to sue someone. And as a matter of fact, the Princess Cruise, I mentioned this to our guest today. I mentioned that the Princess Cruises that landed in Oakland a couple of days ago, they've already had the first big lawsuit filed. I mean, it didn't take very long. I don't for that to happen, and we see more coming down the pike. We got to say, disclaimer, this is not legal advice. What we want you to do is have enough information today. If you're a real estate investor, a landlord, apartment manager, you have enough to go and talk to your lawyer, talk to your risk management person, talk to your insurance agent, whoever you have advising you on these kinds of things. Don't take this as the gospel truth, but this lady has a great background, and I'm going to have her introduce herself, talk a little bit about her background and what makes her uniquely qualified to talk about the risks associated with coronavirus in terms of legal risks. And she's going to just tell us a little bit about what's going on with her own self, because she's actually experiencing it now. She's at ground zero. So welcome to the program, Elizabeth Whitman.
Thank you. Well, as you said, my background is pretty varied. I've had big law firm, small law firm. I worked as an administrative law judge in DC, and I have been general counsel for a national real estate security sponsor that covered multifamily, office, and senior housing. I was also general counsel for their property management companies. So I was at one point general counsel for the 17th largest senior housing company in the nation. And I have a pretty varied experience in dealing with all kinds of crisis management, although this is bigger than anything I had to deal with during my tenure. I now run Whitman Legal Solutions in the Washington, D.C. metro area, which is geared towards providing boutique real estate and business services to clients who want not just a personal touch, but want to find creative solutions to get things done the way they need them in a fashion that's legally permissible. And as for what's going on in my life right now, we got the bombshell dropped, as probably people read in the newspaper yesterday. I'm in Maryland and in the DC metro area. In DC, they've closed everything down. They won't let more than 100 people gather at once. Here in Maryland, they've closed the schools. So I am facing at least a 2-week period of having the entire family in our house at once. We do actually have an older child who is working the front lines, who happens to be in an infectious disease rotation in medical school, working on the front lines, who has some coronavirus patients that she is working with. So we're getting it from all directions.
So you have an intimate knowledge of this. And
well, yeah, we've gotten some text messages that are pretty scary from her. So
do you think that we kind of dropped the ball on this a little bit and maybe didn't take it as seriously? And you, because you had mentioned that you'd had experiences with other quasi-pandemics or whatever. And
yeah, I personally actually had the experience with H1N1 because my son was a preschooler at the time and actually got the disease. We were very fortunate. He was in the high-risk classes, fortunate and unfortunate. But because there were shortages, he was able to get the medications that were needed. But I'm sure there are people who needed them that couldn't get them because they weren't in those high-risk, very low age or very high age categories. So we've experienced it. That didn't seem quite so bad. And I think we've all been lulled into complacency with that experience in this country. And it's been a very long time since we had a quick-moving crisis. I mean, I think the most recent one besides that was the AIDS crisis, which it was very easy for people to ignore or think it didn't apply to them because it was hitting certain target groups initially.
You think people are taking it more seriously now? What do you see around you? Because I'm on the West Coast. I'm far away.
Yeah, well, out here, I think shutting down the schools made it real for people. That isn't something that happens lightly. Telling people in DC that their religious organizations are closed, telling them that that people can't travel here from Europe, it makes it seem very real when you're in an international community like we are here with a lot of embassies and people who have international jobs.
You know, right now it's the panic. People are getting the toilet paper thing, which I'll never understand that. I have my own little funny stories about that. But, well, maybe the toilet paper is worth more than the money. That's my thought. You know, it's probably going to be worth more than the dollar for a while anyway. So people are aware of the economic fallout. I mean, I think in the back of their heads, they understand how this goes. I think now people understand more the interconnectedness of everything and the globalism and everything else. But landlords, because I work a lot with real estate people, landlords are beginning to ask questions. I've actually heard tenants worried that they were going to be sued by the landlords, which I thought that's an interesting perspective, but you never know. And now I have people that own large buildings and they're saying, okay, so what am I liable for and what's going to happen? And I know it's different in every state and who knows where this is going to go, but give us some thoughts. You know, you'd sent me an outline earlier and just talk about the things that landlords can do proactively, maybe to stave this off. We know there's going to be lawsuits, right?
There are always lawsuits, and sometimes there'll be valid lawsuits and many times they won't be. And sometimes it's a matter of perspective, whether they are or not. But I can say one thing that I always find concerning in the law is when there's a separation from control and responsibility. And one thing in commercial real estate that happens is owners give up some measure of control by giving management and operations to a third-party property management company. And while this works very well because you're hiring a specialist who understands that business and presumably keeps it, up to date, that also can be a little scary when the owner is facing potential liability right along there and maybe even ahead of the property management company for something like coronavirus. The first step that I would say for any owner that has commercial real estate at least would be to take a look at their property management agreement, understand what the management company has to do, understand what control the owner has retained and therefore must take care of. Also to take a look at who's going to pay for the expenses associated with dealing with the coronavirus. If the property management company has to, is there a budget? Does there need to be a budget created? And likewise, they can be passed through to the owner. If there's no control over spending, the property management company could spend a lot of money the owner has to pay. On the other hand, you also want to make sure that if some of the risk has been shifted to the property management companies, and a common one might be, for instance, education risk, that the property management company might have to do the education itself, then you want to be sure those costs do fall on the party they should fall on. My next step would be, after figuring out what the contract says, would be to sit down with your manager and work out a plan, get on the same page. You have to work together as a team at this point, regardless of what the contract says. And if they have to modify the contract or have a side letter or some kind of other written document that deals with this truly extraordinary situation, that they should do so.
I don't think anybody anticipated this. This was so unprecedented. It came upon us so fast. Everyone's scrambling. So if you're an investor and you've got some money in this passively, for example, do you want to check with your deal sponsor, with your syndicator, and see what do you want to ask them, just to kind of calm your fears a little bit?
Well, first of all, I think the syndicators should be, the best ones should be sending something out to the investors, telling them what they know, which may not be very much, but at least showing that they're thinking about this. If someone has a significant investment with some kind of a syndicator, the things they probably need to know are just generally, what's the plan? Is there a plan? If there's not, that's a problem. And to maybe ask if there's, I hate to say it, but a capital call in their future. And the sponsor may not know yet, but it's something to think about, particularly at a time where people's cash reserves may have dipped a tad with the sellout in the market these last few days.
Maybe more than a tad.
People may not have the money that they had before, and this may be something that the owner needs to plan for, because to preserve their investment they may legitimately, I mean, these sponsors may legitimately at some point, through no fault of the sponsor, have to do capital calls to keep these investments afloat.
And that's something I think, nobody really have a handle on. So as in terms of, I have a background in commercial property and casualty. And so I'm always interested in risk management. So the first course of event, you said, of course, is to address the problem, admit there's a problem, and then go in there and talk to your property manager and stuff. What are we talking about in terms of exposure? What's going to happen? Like, say, for example, is this a case of your building's been quarantined because 2 of your tenants have it, and now you have to do something? Or is this your whole entire neighborhood's quarantined, so you have to address it? What are we looking at?
Well, it depends on where you live. If you live in New Rochelle, it's the whole entire neighborhood, is what seems to have happened in New Rochelle, New York. I'd say it's much more likely, although, again, it's going to be very localized. It's going to be more likely that individual units, rental units, will be quarantined, that families will be quarantined inside of an apartment complex if it's multifamily. I'd say it's less likely to happen in office or retail space unless there's some kind of a huge outbreak that's directly tied to that particular building or space. I think that's less likely, but again, none of us really know what's going to happen.
No, and I would think also another problem would be, say you've got a class A property and you've got some really not, tenants that work in, they make good money. And then their employer says, sorry, we are closing down your factory, your whatever, wherever you work, your legal office is being closed down. What's going to happen with the rent issue? I mean,
if you're talking about from the landlord's perspective,
yeah.
I think we saw some of that in 2008 or post 2008. We saw what happened when the tenants in commercial office buildings and some industrial buildings had a reduction or elimination of business. And the pattern that happened then was that tenants were either defaulting on leases or they were going to the landlord and saying, we're going to default unless you give us concessions. And the landlord, faced with the possibility of giving concessions or completely losing the tenant, gave the concessions. And the result was that then the landlord's revenue goes down because the revenue has agreed to this, but they have little choice. The landlord then, if it has, depending on its mortgage and how much debt has and how much leverage it has and what covenants are in the mortgage documents, can be at risk at actually defaulting under its mortgage. If it has, for instance, a debt service coverage ratio that requires a certain amount of revenue in relation to their or net revenue based upon a bunch of other factors, but based upon compared to the debt, if the revenue goes down, that DSCR, as it's called, is going to go down and possibly put them in risk of consequences under their loan.
Wow. I mean, it sounds like everyone's going to have to give a little on this because, I mean, if you've got a building that say it's 95% occupied and 80% of your tenants lose their jobs temporarily, you got some major issues here way down the line. I mean,
I don't think it could happen in multifamily too, because just for the reason you said, if some people don't have cash reserves sufficient to carry them even a month, much less 2 or 3 months, or to carry them through an unemployment. And those people are at risk of defaulting on their leases. It's expensive to evict tenants. You kind of look pretty awful to evict someone who's been laid off because of coronavirus, even if economically it's something you'd normally do. So it puts landlords in a very awkward spot because they're not really in the business of operating their buildings for free either.
I mean, what are the liability issues? Like, say, for example, you have some vacancies and you don't want to rent to someone that has been exposed to that virus. Is there also issues with that, or with evicting someone that got it?
And potentially, this is a little bit of uncharted territory. What we have, and HUD has deferred to the CDC, which is not highly helpful, given that CDC doesn't say whether something's a disability. It just tells you how to react to a medical situation, or in this case, a pandemic. But we do have a little bit of guidance from the EEOC for the ADA, and the ADA does apply to certain aspects of multifamily, although the Fair Housing Act applies more to the landlord-tenant relationship. The EEOC guidelines for pandemic preparedness were done back with the H1N1 And they too do defer to the CDC, but they also give some indication that a pandemic could be considered a level of threat that could potentially cause death or serious physical harm that might allow, at least with respect to employees, for an employer to do additional medical testing or inquiries that it would not be allowed to conduct in an ordinary situation. Yeah, we don't know if that's going to apply to landlords, but that's the closest guidance I have quickly found in my attempts to figure out what this is. And as I said, HUD is just deferring to the CDC at this point. And they're the ones who really govern the Fair Housing Act, which is what applies to multifamily owners.
That's true. And then, I mean, I'm thinking those tenants could potentially come back and sue you on their own for
discrimination.
Yeah. So gosh, nobody's even considered that, because that's why I got a hold of you, because I saw your blog, and it was the first time I have seen an attorney post about the potential hazards specifically to property owners. I did see some interesting things from tenants going, oh my gosh, I've been exposed to the coronavirus. If I get it, is my landlord going to sue me because I spread it in this building? And I'm like, there's so many things on this. How do you keep up with all this?
I think that the standard that landlords are going to be held absent some clear regulatory guidance, which so far we don't seem to have. In a lawsuit from a tenant, they're most likely going to be held to a negligence standard, and the negligence standard at common law, if you're not applying any kind of statutory or regulatory requirements, is going to look at whether they followed a reasonable level of care in the industry. And that, from my perspective, requires that landlords be completely on top of the current CDC and their local and state health department guidelines, and that they carefully, and I say carefully because there's always antitrust laws lurking in the background, that they carefully find out and work with their other people in the industry to make sure that they really are following industry standards. It's a lot easier to follow industry standards when they aren't changing daily.
It does morph a lot. I mean, from one day to the next, all the reports that are coming out, so it's hard to keep up with it. But I think, would communicating with your tenants be a good idea? Like saying, hey, nobody really understands all of this, but here's what we're doing, A, B, C.
I can tell you I got an email just like that from my office landlord this morning, saying what they were doing, what they were recommending of tenants, what they were asking tenants to do. And I think they were acting like a very responsible landlord. They also didn't panic and say we're shutting down the building, because at this point there was no indication to do so. But I think what's important is that probably there needs to be a person at the landlord, and whether it be at the property management company or the owner level, if there's a management company, they can have someone doing it. But there needs to be someone who's, number one, checking daily for these CDC, state, and local health guidelines. They need to know exactly what they are. They need to be sure that they are staying on top of the current standard, which I mentioned is changing at least daily, sometimes hourly. And they need to be frequently communicating to tenants what they're doing, what the tenants need to do, and they need to take reasonable effort to protect their tenants from getting some kind of a disease at the property, particularly from a landlord employee who might be ill. And they're going to need to also protect their employees. So it's a real tough balancing act for a landlord or property owner.
I mean, I know it's too late to get masks now. It's too late to get gloves. It's too late to get a lot of things that people would. But what about putting maybe hand washing stations in the lobby or something like that?
Yeah, if you can get hand sanitizer, that seems to be supply right now. But I mean, having or demonstrating that you're hand washing, encouraging people to hand wash, because everyone presumably has like sinks in their rental units, and there are bathrooms in office buildings. And so encouraging the hand washing, something as simple, this sounds silly, but something as simple as providing a trash can near the exit door in a bathroom. A lot of people really like to keep their paper towel and open the doorknob with the paper towel and then throw it in the trash can. I've seen people, actually, my gym is doing that now. So little things like that can go a long ways towards making people feel like you're doing something. And I think what people want most of all is to feel some measure of control, even though the reality is we have very little. And that probably explains the runs on paper products, including toilet paper and hand supply. Hand
Yeah, it is. It is. It's a psychological thing, but it's important because when people don't generally sue people that they like and they feel are acting in their best interest, I mean, fundamentally.
Yeah, and if you look at a couple of the lawsuits that have come out, I mean, well, or at least complaints and big public disputes, the family members of the nursing home in Seattle that's kind of ground zero were expressing upset, not so much because there was coronavirus there, but because they didn't know what was going on. It was the communication that they are claiming is lacking. And I don't think there's a lawsuit on that yet, but they're clearly upset and felt left out. And I think that was a big problem potentially from a PR standpoint and perhaps just from a human caring standpoint on the part of the nursing home if what they're seeing is true. And if you read the news articles on, as you mentioned, the Princess Cruise lawsuit, the people are complaining. They're complaining because they were exposed to coronavirus, but they're complaining, it sounds like, even more because they weren't told. They felt it was hidden from them. And so, honestly, I mean, I understand you don't want to create panic, but honesty and being forthright and communication are very important in any relationship, and that includes a business relationship and a landlord-tenant relationship.
Exactly, and I think you want to keep the channels open. If they have questions and you don't know how to answer them, you could call your attorney, you could call your risk management person and get their questions answered in a timely manner. I know one landlord told me that he was going to show his tenants how he's acting by having his maintenance people clean more often and wipe down, and, you know, in the lobby, wipe down the, you know, I mean, in other words, when they're going in and out, they're seeing a maintenance person there who's spraying with disinfectant and, you know, all the places where people normally touch. And I think that was a good idea. Just like I said, people generally don't sue you if they feel like you're really trying to do something good.
I think most people are reasonable enough to know that this is truly an unprecedented situation. And also there's the, you know, the attorneys to a large extent are the gatekeepers to lawsuits. And many of these lawsuits are brought on a contingent fee basis where the lawyer doesn't get paid if there's no settlement or judgment. And most lawyers don't want to take totally baseless cases because they'll be doing a lot of work for free. So you really need to, if you make an effort and you're not negligent, it's going to be hard for them to find a lawyer who represent them also, even if you have an unreasonable tenant.
Better call Saul, huh? You know, I don't mean to make light of it, but there is some humor coming out of this, and there's some ridiculous behavior like the toilet paper runs and people fighting. I have seen so many videos. Yeah, that's another thing, you know, kind of an ancillary thing. I've seen so many videos where people are getting in fights over hand sanitizer and toilet paper and hitting each other in the Walmart. Will there be a point, do you think, where people do totally panic and abandon the angels of their better selves and start doing things like they wouldn't ordinarily do? I mean, I'm not trying to be a fearmonger here. I'm just saying, you know, that seems to be the progression so far. People seem to be going that direction. Now, what will it mean for a landlord? I mean, he's going to have to keep his tenants in line.
I think so, and I think that by enlisting maybe one way to do this, obviously there's always going to be people who are going to be fearful and lash out because they don't understand things. And let's face it, none of us really understand this. The scientists don't completely understand it. They're trying and they're working fast, but they don't completely understand it. I think that landlords, though, can try to rally their tenants together, as make them feel like they're part of a team working together to go after this monster or, you know, combat this monster. And if they feel like they're all in it together, I think it helps in a way. It's less likely to create individual panic.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head, because I was talking with my teenage daughter last night, and she said, you know, Mom, I know it sounds stupid, but I'm kind of glad this is a pandemic, because it tends to make people think we're all affected by this. We all have to be rational, and we have to behave, and we have to do the right things. And it feels better than just having one country that has something bad going on. I want to ask, you know, because people are going to, I know I have landlords that'll be watching this that'll want to talk to you. How do they, I mean, not every attorney has that background that you have. I mean, you have some unique skill sets. Are you able to help people in multiple states, or how do you work?
I'm licensed in Ohio, Maryland, New York, and the District of Columbia. I have limited my practice to business and real estate. I don't go to court because I don't like going to court. So if lawsuits are involved, I can be a consultant, but I do not defend litigation cases. Certainly, I'm available for people to consult as in the context of maybe an outside general counsel or an outside business advisor. In most states, I'm allowed to do that as long as I am physically sitting in a state I'm licensed in, and as long as I'm not going to court. In most states, I'm allowed to do that. It does vary.
How would they get a hold of you? Because I'm going to put your contact information in the comments section, but I'm also going to ask, how would the quickest way to get a hold of you if they have an issue brewing?
Okay, on my website, Whitman Legal Solutions, Whitman spelled like the candy or the poet, Whitman. It's whitmanlegalsolutions.com. There is actually a contact button, and that is the most likely way to reach someone quickly through my website. You can read the blog while you're on there.
Let's recap. Okay, so I am a multifamily syndicator first. What is the first thing I want to do now that I've got my toilet paper from Costco and I'm all set? What do I want to do?
You need to be sure that you have your asset management team has a handle on what's really going on with the properties, because you need to communicate to your investors what's going on, but you can't do that unless you know. So that involves, again, going to that property management company if it's not you, and getting the data and finding out what's going on, find out the status quo. And that's the step one. The step two is still to come up with a plan. Obviously, executing on the plan is important, but also what's important at that stage is to communicate to the investors frequently and forthrightly what's really going on. You tell them what you've learned, you tell them what the plan is, and if there at any point in time you believe that the properties are in financial trouble, that may need a capital call, may be impaired under their loan, you need to tell the investors that sooner rather than later. Nothing makes investors don't like losing money. They like it even less when they feel they've been lied to or something's been hidden from them.
And so I'm a passive investor. I'm in for the long haul. I'm not going to panic, right? I mean, generally, I'm not going to panic. What am I going to want to do?
I think I'm not an investment advisor, obviously. That's the disclaimer. I'm a lawyer. I have a few, real estate syndications, and I sit tight. You're relying, you've picked your sponsor carefully so that you have a sponsor who you can trust to do the best they can, and you sit tight and you hope all goes well. You have to understand that real estate in the end is virtually always a risky investment. The reason it gives good rewards is because there's high risk. That's basic, economic concept. So there are going to be some deals that, probably go under in this crisis, just like there were in 2008. And you hope yours isn't one of them. You hope you're sufficiently diversified that you're able to, sustain any losses that go on. And otherwise, I'd say that there should be tax planning going on also if you feel like a property isn't going to make it, of how do you deal with potential tax liability, but that's another webcast. Well, and that's something that a responsible sponsor can do, is if a property truly isn't going to make it, there are ways to minimize the tax impact on investors. And so that's something a responsible sponsor should be doing if it gets to that point with a property. And sadly, with the market doing what it's doing, and with this crisis, there will be some properties investments that won't make it.
Yeah, and that's just too horrible to contemplate. I really want to thank you. You have a wealth of information, and your blog, where's your blog located?
It's also at whitmanlegalsolutions.com/blog.
Yeah, so those of you who are investors or syndicators, go and check that out because she has some really interesting things to say. Again, this wasn't legal advice, but you need to be doing something, because I see a lot of syndicators, they're just walking around in circles saying, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? What am I going to tell my investors? You need to tell them something. Show them that you care. Show them that you're being proactive. Show them that you have a plan. Hopefully you had that in the back. Well, nobody anticipated this, but hopefully there was some sort of emergency plan, that you had in mind. And so make sure that you communicate that to them. And if you need somebody to counsel you, reach out to Elizabeth and on her contact page. And I thank you so much for being here, because you were the only one I saw talking about this, and nobody wants to even think about it, because there's enough just thinking about how are we going to get hand sanitizer. There's a big leap, isn't it? It's a huge leap from hand sanitizer to what am I going to do if I get sued? We always have to think about that, because we live in a litigious society, and there are good lawyers like Elizabeth out there, thank God, that are working on behalf of business owners to make sure that they can keep some of the money they're earning. What a concept. So I wish you and your family really, I know you're worried to death about your son. Is it your son or your daughter that's working?
It's not the son that's at home right now.
And then the daughter's out working in the medical field. Please keep in contact with us. I'll be posting this in multiple places, and I'll give you some instructions where you can go in and comment on the video as well. And if you add new blog posts, go ahead and feel free to post it there. I want everyone to have this very valuable information. This is Tammy de Leeuw. This is the Biscuits and Gravy podcast, the special coronavirus edition. Thanks so much, Elizabeth, for being here. Take care. Talk to you later. Thank you so much.